The history of heavy. Welcome to episode 4 of the History of Heavy podcast, a show that traces the chronology of heavy music across genres, song by song. I am your host, Michael Huntsman, along with my co-host, once again, Big Daddy Dave Lieberman. David, hello.
Howdy.
How are you, man?
I'm doing great. Had a good time with episode 3 and looking to dig into episode 4 here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this episode because to me, this is where things start to change a little bit. You know, so far we've talked about Link Wray, the Kingsmen, and the Kinks, all songs I love and all songs that are great. But the Sonics are a little bit further afield. I mean, Link Wray isn't necessarily a household name, but people know that song. We're getting a little bit more to the underground, though, and the subculture with the Sonics, which I am very interested in exploring. And that will be a really consistent theme throughout this podcast. You know, next week we're talking about the Rolling Stones. So, most people have heard of them. But we are going to get pretty deep into some off-the-cuff things as the years progress. But we are not progressing in any year tonight. Tonight we are staying right where we were last week, right, Dave? And your cultural corner is going to talk to us about, I believe, the back half of 1964. Dave's Control!
1964, the B-side. We're talking about July through December. I am going to do a little bit of a callback to June because this came up in my research and I didn't put it in last podcast, and so I got to get it out there. Rudy Jernreich designs the original monokini in 1964. This is a topless swimsuit in the United States. And on June 19th, Carol Doda became the first modern topless dancer in the United States at the Condor Club in San Francisco's North Beach neighborhood.
Let's go.
Yeah,
still there, right?
Still there, right on the corner, Broadway and Christopher Colombo Boulevard, or whatever they called it now. And there was a history of burlesque, in the 1920s, and that's why this moniker of the first modern topless dancer. But after that, topless clubs proliferate in the U.S. and are still around today. July 2nd, the United States Civil Rights Act of 1964 is enacted. July 31st, the Ranger program, the space program, Ranger 7, sends back the first close-up photographs of the moon. These images are 1,000 times clearer than anything ever seen from Earthbound telescopes. August 8th, a Rolling Stones gig in Scheveningen, one of the 8 districts of The Hague, Netherlands, gets out of control. Riot police end the gig after about 15 minutes, upon which spectators start to fight the police. August 27th, Walt Disney's Mary Poppins has its world premiere in Los Angeles. It'll go on to become Disney's biggest moneymaker and winner of 5 Academy Awards, including Best Actress for Julie Andrews. It's the first Disney film to be nominated for Best Picture. In October, Robert Moog demonstrates the prototype Moog synthesizer. I was thinking maybe we could do a cover band Depeche Moog. October 5th, 23 men and 31 women escape to West Berlin through a narrow tunnel under the Berlin Wall. And October 14th, American civil rights movement leader Martin Luther King Jr. becomes the youngest recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. Much of the year of 1964 was dominated by minutia from the Vietnam War. Lots of very significant incidents occurred. Certain battles, there was a coup, there was a lot of political stuff that was going on. Not going to go into all that detail, but the Vietnam War is a huge factor and feature of current events in 1964.
Sure. But we will not be talking about Creedence Clearwater Revival on this show or any other show that I am a part of. What we will be talking about are the Sonics, who released The Witch, their very first single ever, by the Seattle garage rock pioneers. It was released in November of 1964 and appeared on the band's debut album, Here Are the Sonics, the following year. The song never broke into the national charts, but did get regular airplay in the Pacific Northwest, where it influenced in the impressionable young ears that would go on to make the Seattle grunge movement the epicenter of the world during the 1990s. The Witch is without question one of the heaviest songs of the era and is one of the cornerstones of the sound that would later morph into punk and metal. I think this is a crossroads song, and I want to talk a lot about that. In fact, Dave, we started the conversation about garage rock back on episode 2 when we got into the Kingsman cover of Louie Louie, which was released less than a year before The Witch. But I think The Witch is a completely different proposition. So let's pick up that thread a little bit. And I want to talk about, first of all, the heaviness of The Witch. And I kind of teased it at the top. But to me, and look, we are doing these episodes, this podcast, kind of in a vacuum. So we're very focused on what is currently now 149 songs. I added one yesterday that I forgot to mention to you.
150.
No, it's 149 now. It was
okay.
148.
With that one. Right.
Yeah. So we are kind of have a very specific. We have a telescope, not binoculars, to look at this thing, or a sniper's rifle, not a shotgun, is maybe a better way to. So there's lots of things in the periphery that we are ignoring that are happening at the same time, and other heavy songs, and songs that could be talked about in this context. But that aside, just staying with our own kind of myopic view of the history of heavy. From Rumble to Louie Louie to You Really Got Me is one thing, but to me, even here in 2025, The Witch is a completely different proposition. To me, our first 3 episodes where we sort of talked about, and I think I asked you on each of the previous episodes, Dave, does this sound heavy to you? Is this heavy? I don't think there's any question that The Witch is heavy. So just give me your reaction to The Witch, and actually, along with your reaction, I'd love to know your history with the song, your history with the Sonics. And this is a band that you and I have, like a lot of bands on this show, you and I have never talked about. So I'm curious your history with them and your take on them.
Yeah, well, my history goes back about a week. I've never heard this song before.
Oh, wow.
Never heard of this band before. I was not aware of the Sonics. Pleasantly surprised to be introduced to them in this way. This song is definitely heavy, and I absolutely agree with you that we kind of pivot a little bit and lean further into what has always been our more mainstream, straight ahead heavy version, right? We've talked, we started at a fundamentals level, things that set the stage for heavy and have a foot in heavy. This is both feet in heavy. The pace of it, the scale of it, the subject matter, right? Now we're getting a little evil. And even if it's a 60s version of that and it's very approachable, this is where we start to pay attention to that. So this song is heavy on the one hand. I like this song on the other hand. This is a good song.
Excuse me, I'll edit that out. Yeah, I'm kind of surprised that you were completely unfamiliar with the Sonics. I love this band and became familiar with them in the early 2000s when they were part of, I think right around that time, the Nuggets compilations that kind of became a big deal, that were kind of based on 60s and 70s psychedelia and garage rock. That was a very popular big deal box set, and fell in love with the Sonics and that first album in particular. Um, to me, that line from the Sonics to specifically Mudhoney, but all of that Seattle grunge sound, it's such a clear straight line. Like, oh yeah, these guys are just doing the Sonics, other than
100%.
Soundgarden, who were just doing Black Sabbath. But sort of, you put Sabbath and the Sonics in a stew, and that, drop it in Seattle, and that's grunge.
Yep.
Um, this song, to me, what I love about this song is and why I was excited to hold our garage rock conversation until now, because to me, this song, for at least the 20 some odd years that I've been listening to it, is sort of garage rock ground zero. It's not really, because Louie certainly could, there's other things, and again, that we're kind of keeping the periphery away from the conversation. But to me, the Sonics are sort of like, if somebody said, what's garage rock, the Witch would be the first thing I would play. But what I think is interesting, to continue our conversation from last time, is that sort of, those tentacles, those crossroads that sort of, if garage rock is in the middle, one tentacle becomes punk and one tentacle becomes metal. I think there's more punk in the Sonics than there is metal, but it's certainly in there. And I think I love subgenres. I love thinking about genre and blending of genres. But how would you describe the Sonics and the Witch? Is garage rock, does it sound punk to you? Like, what's the energy you get from it?
Proto grunge. I mean, you had it at the beginning, right?
Right.
This is the garage rock motion towards something, and it hasn't. It's still the stock. I'm gonna milk this tree analogy for the rest of this episode. Um, it's the stock before we have a split into branches, or this is the trunk, right? It's higher up on the trunk. It's farther away from the soil, from ground zero. When you introduced the garage rock conversation in Louie, that was only 1963, right? So that's last year. Ground zero for garage rock can be a little bit of space, right? Because it's going to lead to many, many years of legacy. So I don't think it's inappropriate to include Louie and the Witch in ground zero garage rock. It's just another band that's doing that at the same time. And this happens a lot in inventions. There's inventions that have happened at almost the same time at different parts of the world, just because the technology is ripe and the requisite knowledge that it's building on is at the same stage, and it's available to different people in different parts of the world. And so the same kind of thing happens worldwide. Like cars, right? Cars come about in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but engines of all kinds are happening, and they're happening all over the world, and they're being powered by all kinds of different things. There's no rules yet, so it's just all happening. Later it becomes standardized. So right now is that moment for garage rock, and we see the Sonics are another foray into that, or another offering in that still ground zero moment.
Really well said. I think the interesting part of the thinking of that moment being ground zero, and obviously, these hearing each other. Well, nobody was hearing the Sonics on the radio in 1964, but they were certainly hearing the Kinks and the Stones and kind of what those bands were doing and being influenced. And so influences were obviously happening over the radio and whatever.
Right.
But
Right.
but the idea, the energy of the vocal on Louie Louie, and we talked about it on that episode, and about, how he has the kind of the mistake after the guitar solo, and how kind of raw that is and rambunctious that is. The way that Jerry Rosley, the singer of the Sonics, sings The Witch, it's a completely different animal than what is happening on the Kingsman version of Louie Louie in terms of sort of manic energy. And it's not so far from The Witch to the Stooges, right? Jerry Rosley becomes Iggy Pop at some point. And that's just completely wild to me, that those things, Louie Louie and You Really Got Me and The Witch, were sort of all happening at the same time because of the rambunctiousness. It's such a completely different animal. And maybe that's why it was underground, right? It was the underground before the underground was really defined as the underground, I guess. It just, if you weren't signed to a record label, you weren't being heard. But the energy of we've talked about this on a few episodes before, where, punk isn't necessarily heavy. And we're not talking about at least right now, we're not talking about a Mudhoney song. One might be added at some point. But that tentacle that becomes punk rock isn't as heavy, as obviously the one that would become metal. But to me, and you said it when you first started talking about the song, to me, there's no debate as to whether or not The Witch is heavy. The Witch is heavy as fuck.
Yeah. Well, and to kind of tie it together, in the following, in a couple of years, in 1966, the Sonics will do a cover of Louie Louie.
Right. That's
so
right.
They're all listening to each other. They're all talking to each other. They're all in the same boiler room, right?
Yeah.
This is their networking, right? And they're coming together in this kind of format, and they're making their own songs, but they're working on a genre here.
Sure. So genre is an interesting, again, I love talking about genre. I love thinking about genre. Rick Beato, about a month ago, big YouTube music guy, did a little brief thing about the notion of genre, a dominant genre being dead. And clearly that's the case, but I wanted to talk through it with you because I thought it was kind of interesting. If you think about the 30s and 40s, the predominant music genre was jazz. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, effectively, rock and roll was the predominant genre. In the 80s, it kind of becomes, MTV pop, new wave and all of that. In the 90s, it was grunge. Since really social media and music streamers, so everything from YouTube to Facebook to Spotify and Apple Music, the notion there is no dominant genre anymore, because each of us as a listener has the ability to decide what genre we are interested in. I don't even say this in jest. I say it as fact. I have never heard, as far as I am aware, I have never heard a Taylor Swift song, which is,
I'm sure you have.
I
have
honestly,
you been to a cafe in your life? Have you been?
So honestly, I may have, but I don't think I've ever heard a Taylor Swift song. I obviously am very familiar with who Taylor Swift is. And
Sure.
my point is that would have been impossible.
Right.
Up until 10 years ago.
Well, the only way that you had to connect with music for many years was the radio. And you listened to the radio to learn what songs were available. And there were things like American Bandstand, but they were another venue for what was already happening on the radio. The DJs, but DJs were kingmakers, right? And we learned about that with Louie and the King and the Kingsmen. A DJ heard this and made it famous by saying it was terrible, right? Yeah, DJs were a real they were kingmakers. I think that sums it up. And then MTV comes about, and then that becomes a huge tour de force and changes the balance of power. And then streaming happens, right? And so it gets very fragmented. And now we're in a time, and we have been for some time. And this is actually, I have trouble with this because we're in a time now where you proactively pick whatever you're going to want to listen to, and you have a world of music to choose from. And I don't always know. I have a association with mood and music. Music will put me in a mood, or I'm in a mood that I want to steep in for a little while. And a lot of times that's clear to me, and a lot of times it's not. And when it's not clear to me, I'm stuck. I don't know what to listen to. Because if I listen to something that will put me in a mood, but I'm not sure if that's the mood I want to be in, and it's really confusing. And I struggle with this time that we're in, where I have to pick something. So I'll just leave it there. We can talk more about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because my son, my 25-year-old son, and I'm guessing your daughter, Dave, you're significantly younger than 25 years old, daughter, he doesn't hear genre. Like he doesn't even think about genre.
Right.
And when I was growing up, when you were growing up, we were defined by genre. Like you were a punk rock kid,
yes,
metal kid,
it was your identity,
wave kid, and that's not true anymore. Kids don't. I mean, they might be obsessed with an artist like Taylor Swift, but or Billie Eilish or whatever. But they're not. Hey, I'm a pop kid, or I'm a goth. I mean, I guess goth is a lifestyle, not a genre. But yeah, I think that's really interesting. And in the context of this experiment, if you Google the history of heavy, it will automatically autofill metal.
Yes.
Because it thinks you're looking for the history of heavy metal.
Right.
And when I think about heavy, I don't think about metal. I mean, I do, but I don't only think about metal. And as will be considered, I mean, in 2 episodes, we're going to be talking about John Coltrane. And we will dig into hip hop and electronic music and drone and a whole bunch of different stuff that has nothing to do with well, I shouldn't say that. It but is not heavy metal, decidedly not heavy metal. And so I think as it relates to heavy and the umbrella of what we are talking about, and the witch in particular, tonight's topic, heavy can mean, as we continue to say, heavy can mean a lot of different things. I think it is interesting that so far, and then continuing next week with the Stones, but obviously not when we get to Coltrane, so far, I think the only instrument we've talked about is the guitar. We have not talked about even drums or bass, really, in any of the songs that we have discussed. And I think appropriately so. I think the things that have made the songs we've talked about heavy so far is predominantly the guitar. I think what changes with The Witch, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the other element that makes this song heavy is the vocal. The vocal now becomes a thing that is capital H heavy, where with Rumble there is no vocal, but Rumble, Louie, and You Really Got Me, it's really the guitar. And if not for the guitar, those songs aren't included in these conversations. You can tone the guitar down significantly in The Witch, and if you keep that vocal, it's still pretty heavy.
Agreed. Yeah. And just to expand on that point that you made about, and we're going to keep hammering this because the instinct is history of heavy means heavy metal, and we are really exploring, we're threading the needle. We're exploring all that is heavy, and that includes heavy metal. and it includes things that are not heavy metal and that people may not have considered if they think about what is heavy. But as we do with the cultural corner, we're setting a point in time of reference for a particular song. And so the point in time that we want to think about in this conversation is the evolution of this thematic element in music that happens from 1958 to the present, because it exists in a lot of different places. And I mentioned early in the conversation with Link Ray that we could talk about classical music, and there's some classical composers that are heavy. But we're not going back a couple hundred years. That would really be too long of a song list. We decided to pick it up at Link Ray, and that's our arbitrary decision, and we're taking it forward from there. And that's a fair enough place to start. But yeah, this song is where we pivot and lean a little bit more into heavy, because not only the guitar, but the vocals, not only the sound, but the lyrics. We're 2 feet in heavy now.
Really, really well said. Yeah, I think, what, again, we really haven't talked about anything other than the guitar. The other thing I don't think we've talked that much about, will become increasingly important to me as we go, is what emotions these songs evoke. Because I think, the common energy associated with metal and with punk is anger. And there's certainly anger in The Witch, but there's a lot of other stuff going on with heavy as well that I want to explore as we get into it. And I didn't prep you for this, but let's just use The Witch as kind of a starting point for this kind of conversation going forward. And when you think about The Witch and understanding this is, a relatively new song to you, is there a particular emotion that it evokes, or is it not emotional? Is it just kind of like, oh, I like this song, or I don't?
I really like this thread that you're pulling on. The thing that occurs to me is a word I stumbled on in maybe episode 1 or 2. Defiance. There's a defiance that's walking right next to the anger, right? It's not raw anger, it's just raw emotion. And some of that is defiance. We talked about the emergence of the teenager as a demographic and as an identity, on the cultural radar in this time period, late 50s into the 60s. And this is exploring some more of that. Like, what is the teenager if not a victim of adolescence, right? And that is nothing. That is raw emotion, right? And it's big emotion, and it's mixtures of emotion. It's not clear at all. So the concept of having some anger with some attitude, Link Ray gives us the permission and lays attitude right at the beginning of this conversation. Attitude is going to be part of what makes heavy heavy. And we have this defiance a little bit. We have distortion. What is distortion if it's not a confusion of emotions? It's a sonic version of adolescence. So we have a confluence of elements that is creating what we're connecting with as heavy. And so that is present here in this song. It is emotional, and it's not clean. And that's just that enough is what makes it heavy. It's emotional. It's not clean. There's a darkness. It's not pure anger. It's just dark.
Right. I'm glad you framed it that way, because, and selfishly, part of this entire exercise, this podcast, this whole thing, is me wanting to work through my understanding of all of this music in real time. So this is very therapeutic and helpful for me. But emotionally heavy, I think, is really, really important. And that is one of the defining things where we will get into songs that maybe don't intuitively make sense on this list. John Coltrane maybe doesn't make sense to some people to be on a History of Heavy podcast, but man, that shit is heavy. And
it might not make sense to them yet, but when we're done with it, they're going to get it.
Okay.
They're going to get it. And
Well,
and I do want to just validate this collaboration, because this is really how I think. And you'll hear me struggling to explain something and settling on something that I feel really nails it and that you connect with. Because what I'm doing is I'm feeling something and I'm saying it out of my mouth and hearing it with my own ears. And that feedback loop, I have to do a couple of times before it aligns with my gut. And when I get my mouth and my ear and my gut in alignment, that's when I know what my mind is. That's what I know when I'm thinking. So it all starts with this emotion, but in order to get at what that means, there's a feedback loop. And some of that is collaborative with you and bouncing off of how you react. And then oh yeah, no, I don't mean that. I mean this. That's always been a part of my process. And it can be off-putting if people aren't used to that, because they'll say, oh, I have this idea. Oh, I think that's terrible. What? Oh, actually, I think it's awesome. What I thought was terrible was this one thing, but like I have to think it through and say it and hear it. So this is a really good way, I think, to get at something that has been inside bubbling. To get it out, it takes some processing, some post-production.
I love you. That is exactly why I wanted to do this with you, because that over-analysis and intellectualization, if I can even say that word, is the energy that I wanted to be able to bounce my manic sort of emotion about all of this stuff off of. So it's really, really great. And emotion comes into the kind of the way we end these shows, and that is song v song. So that is where we pit our current champion, each of our individual current champion, against tonight's song. Each of our current champion is You Really Got Me. We both, that song, that King's classic, is the song that came out of the battle last week. But what about this week, Dave? Do the Kings take the witch, or do the Sonics win the day?
I'm climbing the ladder, man. The Sonics win. They're leaving the Kinks on the mat.
Yeah, for me too.
They'll be my champion.
For me too, and I really hope we can stick with this, because at some point, 140 some odd episodes from now, we will end with either one or two of the heaviest songs of all time. So that will be a good time.
Listen, when you first pitched this, I thought, no way. And then I said, okay, I'm in for a 10-round contract. And now I'm like kind of all in. This is a great example of my thought process and how my collaborative process works. I will tell you, spoiler alert, we're going to hit Black Sabbath and I'm going to get stuck right there.
We'll see, because you're not, you are not pitting Black Sabbath's catalog. We will see what Sabbath song we end up with, but that song might not be. Maybe I'll have to pick a weaker Black Sabbath song so that it can't be your
You said weaker Black Sabbath song.
All right, let's end it right there. We will be back next week with the Rolling Stones and I Can't Get No Satisfaction. That'll be next time. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, thank you. Bye.